Okay. Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Uh, it's quite evening here in the Philippines, around 11 o'clock in the evening. And by the way, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Joshua Matipo, uh, from the Philippines, from the Republic of the Philippines, and I will be discussing the Philippine Revolution. So this conflict is quite a footnote or a little known conflict which which occurred on the later part of the 19th century between Spain and its colonies, particularly the Philippines. So this revolution is considered as the first Asian nationalistic revolution which successfully uh, overthrew a Spanish regime in Asia, particularly uh, European. Okay, so before I begin, uh, I would like to show to you the uniform that most of the revolutionary used, particularly on the later part, the Redillo. And I will be portraying Hernando Reyes, one of the survivors of the first battles of the revolution, particularly the Battle of San Juan del Monte. Okay, and then later on, he joined General Aguinaldo's army, and he experienced a lot of battles against the Spaniards and later on the Americans. So, a quick background about the Philippine Revolution. So, in the 19th century, after Spain had lost most of its colonies in the Americas, particularly in Latin America, uh, some parts of North America, Mexico, which was being ruled which the Philippines was being ruled by Mexico through Mexico for 250 years. However, when Mexico declared its independence and finally separated itself from Spain, the Philippines was directly administered by Madrid, by the peninsula, by the Iberian Peninsula. And then in 1815, they opened the islands to world trade. So there's a couple of new ideas coming in, like liberalism, secularism, freedom of speech, freedom of thought. So most of those influences came from the American and the French Revolution, which cumulated little by little into not just only to the Spaniards who were living in the Philippines, but also to the Filipinos themselves, the natives, who the Spaniards being called them Indio. So from that on, uh, there came the middle class. So the middle class rose up, uh, rose up uh, due to world trade, and many of them got rich uh, at the same time, and then they're sending their children to different schools, both in here locally in Manila and in European universities such as in Barcelona, in Madrid, in Paris, and in Germany. So many of them are being enlightened with new Western ideas, uh, especially on the concept of a republic. Then, during the Napoleonic Wars, the Philippines has its representation in the Spanish Cortes, uh, as the result of the Cadiz Constitution of 1812. However, it was lost in 1832. So, the problem is there is no representation in the islands from Madrid. And then And then from that on, the Filipinos are now calling for reforms in the islands. They're calling for greater freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of freedom of political participation, and equal treatment before the law. Because before that, the Spaniards um, has a better treatment compared to the natives of the islands. And then there came 1872, where three Filipino priests named Padre Gomez, Padre Burgos, and Padre Zamora were falsely accused of fermenting a revolution, and they were summarily executed by guillotine. From that on, the middle class are now calling for greater freedoms, greater reforms in the islands in terms of colonial rule. So in 1880s, they launched the propaganda movement, which was led by known Filipino ilustrados or enlightened ones like Dr. Jose Rizal, uh, uh, Graciano Lopez Haina, Marcelo H. Del Pilar, and others who are calling for political reforms in the islands and at least representation in the Spanish Cortes. However, due to series of unstable governments in the peninsula itself, they were not able to grant the reforms that the Filipinos are asking. So, when Rizal returned to the Philippines in 1892, he was arrested by the Spanish colonial authorities and was put into exile in Zamboanga, particularly in Dapitan. From then on, there were some elements of the Filipinos who wanted separation from Spain through violent means. And then there is many of them, or most of them, founded the Katipunan, or its whole name, KKK. Now, KKK is different in the US is different from KKK here in the Philippines. When we say KKK here in the Philippines, it means kataas-taasan, kagalang-galangang katipunan ng mga anak ng bayan, or the noblest, the highest and noblest and respectful sons of the nation. So, from 1892 until 1896, little by little, they recruit every Filipinos, regardless of status in life, rich, poor, even some mestizos or half-breed joined the cause of the revolution. However, the revolution was started prematurely upon a discovery by a priest named Padre Mariano. When the plot was discovered, the Spanish colonial authorities acted quickly. And then, having no choice, its third president, Andres Bonifacio, led the revolution, decided to start the revolution right away. However, he was defeated in the Battle of San Juan del Monte, which is now San Juan City in Metro Manila. So he went to hiding. However, the revolution spreads quickly. There were some victories that were achieved, led by a young mayor from Old Cavite or Kawit Cavite by the name of Emilio Aguinaldo. So he was able to defeat the Spaniards in a set pace battles. And then by next year he was elected by majority of the revolutionaries to become the revolutionary leader, the president of the revolutionary government. And then at the end of 1897, both Spain and the revolutionaries struck a deal, a compromise, that the reforms will be implemented in exchange of the Philippine revolutionaries surrendering their arms. Then, by 1898, they were able to return upon the declaration of war between Spain and the United States, and the revolutionaries under Aguinaldo had a informal alliance with the United States. Upon Aguinaldo's return, one by one, cities and towns in the Philippines have been fallen into the hands of the revolutionary forces. And then, on June 12, 1898, the Philippine independence was formally declared in Kawit, Cavite. And later that year, they were able to craft a constitution, which now we call it Malolos Constitution. And now, we have able to establish a republic. However, tensions ran high between the Americans and the Filipinos. So there started the Philippine-American War, or it was formerly called the Philippine Insurrection. It was a longer war compared to the Spanish-American War. Until 1901 and 1902, when Aguinaldo was captured, most of the generals surrendered. However, the struggle continued in the southern part of the Philippines, particularly in the Muslim-held areas. And the conflict there continued until 1913. Okay? So that's the brief summary of the Philippine Revolution. Now, I would like to showcase to you what they were wearing and what are the arms that were used during the revolution. Okay? So let's start with the clothing. So many of them at the first phase of the revolution had wear a civilian clothes made of abaca or made of piña, or we call it camisa. And then later on, they were able to capture the Spanish uniforms and revise it or redesign it as their own. It was called a blue stripe. It was called a rayadillo. So this is a rayadillo I'm wearing. Can you see here? It's a blue stripe with blue and white stripes. And then most of them are using this hat. It was called buri or baliwag hat, which was made out of coconut leaves, and it was being strung together into a formidable hat. Then also, some of them, most of the revolutionary forces were able to be exiled from the Philippines to Hong Kong, so they were able to use British pit helmets. Some of them used Kuracha caps, or some. It's quite looks like almost a Persian cap. And then the primary weapon of the Filipinos, since some of them have lacked weapons or guns or rifles, ammunition, they use the itak or the bolo. Okay? So, this is the primary weapon of the Filipinos, especially in a close quarter combat. They use this. And then, we have here a sample of a M93 Mauser rifle. Although it's a replica, but during that time, Spain was able to acquire a permit to reproduce the Mauser the Mauser rifle from Germany. So they were able to use that. So it's a bolt action. So it's a bolt action, contains of 5 rounds. Okay. And then let me show you here the 2 types of caps, the 2 types of hats that was used during the Revolution. Let's start with the Spanish one, which has a red and gold cockade, and having here is a seal of the Spanish crown, and also technically it's like a buri hat or a baliwag hat. While in the establishment of the first Philippine Republic in 1899, the revolutionaries, now the Republicans, have used blue and red with a triangle, and this triangle has 3 stars, and the sun has a face. Okay, and also here, just like mine. Okay, so I had here some ranks from the Revolutionary era. So this is a rank of a brigadier general, and then this one was used by a captain general in the early part of 1898, but it was already revised. Okay, so now let's go to the flag. So this flag, the Philippine flag, is the legacy of the Philippine Revolution. It pertains the red, blue, white, and yellow, or most it's gold. So this flag actually was first used in the Battle of Alapan, whereby it was being showcased by General Aguinaldo upon defeating the Spanish forces in Alapan in Cavite. So yesterday we celebrated the National Flag Day in commemoration of that battle. Now, to those who didn't know the significance of the Philippine flag and the symbolisms behind it, these 3 stars pertaining to 3 groups of islands: Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao. And then the red stands for valor, the blue stands for justice and peace. The white triangle symbolizes for liberty, equality, and fraternity. So, a fun fact, the Philippine Revolution was inspired from American and French Revolution. So, you will see here the colors of republicanism. The white, the sun, as you can see here, with 8 rays, symbolizes the 8 provinces who first rose up against the Spanish authorities at the start of the revolution. Okay, so any questions so far? Now we can entertain questions. So, by the way, shout out to the Republica Filipina reenactment group. Many of them are now watching. And also from other reenactment groups from the Philippines, like Buhay na Kasaysayan, Philippine Living History Society, La Liga Generales. So, the reenactment here in the Philippines is quite growing little by little, and they were able to doing some research about the uniforms, the gears that was used. And also shout out to Engineer Perry Javier of Buhay na Kasaysayan for researching some of our uniforms. Okay. Question. This is what other weaponry would have been used? So, some of it, aside from the bolo and the rifles, like the Mauser and then the Remington rolling block which is a breech loading rifle. And then, uh, since there were shortages of there are shortages of weapons, of firearms, they exalt to use close range weapons such as bamboo spears and the bolos. Some of them are using bow and arrow in fighting the Spanish forces. Now, fun fact here, many of the Filipinos were able to make up. Okay. Did you get any support from other nations? Okay. Basically two. It's the United States on the later part in 1898. And when we are now fighting with the Americans, some Japanese volunteers from the Meiji government were able to provide assistance with the First Philippine Republic. Also, one of those who supported the Philippine Revolution is Sun Yat-sen, Dr. Sun Yat-sen, the father of modern China. So he was able to secure arms together with Dr. Mariano Ponce. They were able to secure Morata rifles. Unfortunately, it was sank. It was not able to arrive in the Philippines due to a shipwreck during a typhoon. Okay, so yeah, basically it's the United States and Japan who assisted the Filipinos in their struggle for independence. Okay, any more questions? All right. Okay. So it's aside from the United States and Japan, after the Battle of Manila Bay, there were a lot of countries who had stationed around the Manila Bay, such as the Russians, the British, the Japanese, the French, and particularly the Germans. So there was a encounter between Commodore Dewey and Admiral Dietrich of the German Oceanic Fleet. However, the Americans were backed up by the British fleet, which sailed from Hong Kong. Okay. So, any more questions so far? Okay. So, actually, unfortunately, the Philippine Revolution succeeded at first with overthrowing the Spanish colonial powers. Okay. From Sebastian, did the Spanish military had any influence in the way the Philippine army was trained and organized? Good question. So, when the First Philippine Republic was formally established in 1899, the Philippine Republican Army used the 1896 Ordinance de Ejército, or the Spanish Army Ordinance. So basically, when the Philippine American started, most Filipino officers are using Spanish drills, which they were able to inherit from Spain. At the same time, they were able to inherit the fighting style of okay. So so many of it had a okay. Sorry. So if you will see basically if you will see, during the Philippine-American War, they used many of the Filipinos, particularly in the formal army, were able to use Spanish drills, Spanish commands, and Spanish way of fighting. However, October 1899, the when the revolutionary forces were soundly defeated, and most of them had lost their lives, Aguinaldo issued the decree to the remaining forces to conduct a guerrilla warfare. So it's going back to the basics of close quarter combat and guerrilla tactics. So the bloody pace of the Philippine-American War had had started on that. So many of them, disguised as civilians, they will do hit and run tactics. Some of them will steal ammunition from the Americans, steal some information. Okay. How difficult is to get hold of the uniforms and equipment for this time period? Okay. On the early phase of the revolution, okay, so let's start with the first question. The how difficult uh, is it to hold of uniforms and equipment for this time period? Okay, so basically, on the first phase, they were able to capture some uniforms from the Spanish colonial authorities using the Redillo. However, after Spain was defeated in 1898 and the Filipinos were able to start organizing themselves, they were able to manufacture uniforms, Redillos, which have a different design from the Spanish ones. Most of them, some designs have pockets, have here on the chest. Others have 4 pockets, like this. Some, particularly the ordinary soldier or the NCO, used the designs inherited from the Spanish era. Okay, what changed after the Philippines changed hands between the Spanish and the Americans? What did the average soldier see any changes, or was it more doctrine and high command changes? So basically, there's no time to adapt more formal doctrine and high command changes. However, there is one general by the name of Antonio Luna who tried to organize the Filipino officers as well as the Philippine Army, since he was trained in Europe. So they had adapted European tactics on the first phase of the Philippine-American War. However, due to the marksmanship skills of the Americans on shooting the Filipinos, they were unable to adjust to the new fighting styles with the Americans. Thus, many of the Filipinos were not able to prevent the Americans from advancing. So that's it. And at the same time, the average soldier, it's more of the difficulty of adapting, since for a short period of time, the Filipinos were trying their best to organize themselves into a nation state, and they were trying to get recognition from other foreign powers. However, due to the Treaty of Paris, it formally changed hands from Spain to the United States, which was the representative from the Philippines, Felipe Agoncillo, was not permitted to join the proceedings during the treaty. Okay, any questions so far? Okay. So, any questions so far on 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 that? Okay. What equipment uh, would an average shoulder or shoulder shoulder? Okay. What equipment would a average shoulder have? So basically, uh, they use the bolo and then the rifle, and then I have here a 1888 Spanish webbing. So, they have ammunition pouches which were able to captured from the Spaniards, and later on they have adapted on their own. Okay. So they use this. They basically copied the Spanish equipments, however, with some details or differences. So why? Because some of the Filipinos are have a close quarter weapon such as the bolo. And then, as their primary weapon, it's either the Mauser M93 or the Remington rolling block. Okay. Anything else? So, basically, uh, when they're using guerrilla tactics, especially the Spanish and the Americans, were dreadful of the bolo attacks by the Filipinos. Okay, was the bolo used for combat or mainly as a tool for cleaning, brush, and branches? Actually, it's both. Okay. Yes. Okay. Oh. Actually, it was both. Basically, the bolo essentially originated as a cutting tool used in farms. However, since at the start of the revolution, and there is a shortage of firearms, this is the primary weapon of the Filipino revolutionary. Okay, I read that the Philippine Army changed tactics from organized resistance to guerrilla sometime during the war. Could you comment on these changes of tactics? Okay. Basically, just like I told before, um, when at the battle in Pangasinan, most of the Filipino soldiers were being wiped out by the Americans through a pincer movement, first led by Lawton and then MacArthur and Wheaton, in an effort to capture Aguinaldo. So after most of the infantry soldiers were defeated, or many of them captured or killed, Aguinaldo, like I said before, decided to shift to guerrilla tactics in order to inflict uh, more casualties on the Americans, and because of the lack of ammunition, the lack of men trained in the use of rifle, and the seriously shortage of supplies. Okay. What is the Filipino rifle chambered to? Chambered. So basically, it's a like the Mauser, which was inherited from the Spaniards, was a bolt action rifle. But on the earlier it was chambered with a let's say 5 by 7 millimeters, just like other Mauser bullets at the time. Okay. Okay. What type of ammunition does it take? Yeah, it's five. It's I remember it's 7.75 by 5 millimeters. That's the actual specs of is uh, what is a sandatahanes, a different unit. So sandatahanes came from the word sandata, means weapon. So sandatahanes were basically militiamen, which was organized in the first phase of the revolution, using the bolos, the bamboo spears or the bukawes, and they were the ones who conduct hit and run tactics. Now, during the first phase of the Philippine-American War, they were successfully employed to create chaos inside the cities, serving like a fifth column, and however, they were stopped by the Americans due to more ammunition and marksmanship tactics. So the Sandatahanes is basically a militiaman compared to the regular army, which was deployed during the Philippine-American War. Oops. Okay, sorry. Any difficulties? So far. So, any questions? Okay. How long did the fighting go on for? Okay. So, historians are debating on the length of the war. Uh, During the Philippine Revolution against Spain, it took 2 years from 1896 to 1898, particularly August 1898. And there were some remaining pockets of resistance from the Spanish authorities in the Visayas, Mindanao, and in Baler, which is most of them were able to hold longer until the end of 1898. The latest is June 1899. And then the war with the Americans started in 1899 up to 1902, which was being formally declared by President Roosevelt that the fighting in the Philippines was over. However, they didn't take into the account the Moro resistance or the Muslim resistance in Mindanao. Okay. Does the hat you show display rank or type of unit you were? Is there any insignia? Also it is mainly to protect from the sun. Yes. So some of them, like this, during the Philippine-American War, this brown type used by the line infantry, and then the red type was being used by the Kawit Brigade or the Presidential Security Guard of President Aguinaldo during that time. Also, the regular army in the Philippine-American War uses a Republican cockade, which, as you could see, the seal of the First Philippine Republic. 3 stars, and then as the sun has a mythical face, or they called it the Sol de Mayo, or the Son of May, which was inherited from Spanish, Austronesian, and Masonic traditions, since most of the revolutionary leaders were Masons. So at the same time, the ranks were being displayed in the shoulder during the Philippine-American War. However, during the first phase of the revolution against Spain, most of the ranks were being put here in the calves. Mostly from Magdalo Council of Cavite, while the Magdiwang Council uses patches or armbands to signify their ranks, whether they were generals, colonels, or corporals to begin with. So basically, in the first phase of the revolution, they used patches or armbands, and then when they were able to discuss among themselves, they used the calves, and later on, they used the shoulder ranks to signify their position or their rank in the Revolutionary Army. Okay. Fun fact. Actually, the tradition of the Philippines regarding the flag, when it was on the state of war, was being put upside down, had started during the late 1898, when we are fighting the Spaniards and then against the Americans. Okay. Was the bolo used as a part of the Kali martial arts, or did it have a unique style? If so, Is it really a style that you could use in combat during war? Yes, there were different kinds of informal kali or arnis de mano styles used during the Revolution and the Philippine American War, particularly in conducting hit and run tactics or close quarter combats against the Spaniards and later on the Americans. Uh, what did specific uh, ranks insignia looks like? Okay, let me show you quite closer. So basically, the generals on the later part of the revolution and the Philippine American uses the sun to signify their ranks, and the sun and some laurels surrounding the sun. Others, on the lower ranks, like from the colonel down, the colonel, the lieutenant colonel, and the captain basically use silver stars and bronze stars for lower junior officers. Okay. So basically, when you have a insignia of a sun in your shoulder, means you belong to the general rank. When your star is silver, basically you belong to the senior officer's rank. But here's the catch. Uh, uh, the higher rank you have, particularly on the colonel, major, captain, the lower, the the higher rank you get, the lower stars or the fewer stars you will get. Okay, for example, if you are a, let's say, comandante or a major, so you have 3 golden stars. The lieutenant colonel has two golden stars, and the colonel has 1 golden star. And then, as for the junior officers, let's start with the captain. The captain basically has 1 star, 1 silver star. The first lieutenant has 2 silver stars, and the second lieutenant basically has 3 silver stars. Okay. What about the NCOs? Okay, I'll add. So, they have significant markings or calves in their sleeves, particularly from the sergeant. They have 3 chevons. The cabo basically has 2, and the private basically has 1 chevon. Particularly, it was being used at the start of the Philippine American War. Okay? So, yeah. Regarding Kali, yeah, the bolo is essentially being used in the Kali martial arts, as I told you before. And there were different kinds of disciplines within the Kali or the arnis de mano. So basically, the Kali martial arts or the arnis de mano was descended into a eskrima vulgar, which was being taught by the Spaniards during the start of their colonialization in the 16th century. So basically, they were able to fuse the pre-colonial style of fighting with the eskrima vulgar. So here, essentially that's being taught secretly to avoid detection from the Spanish authorities, or it was being adapted from everyday living or everyday work. Okay. So, any questions so far? Any any ano any comments or reactions? Okay. So, it's almost midnight here in the Philippines, so thank you so much for tuning in to our discussion on the Philippine Revolution. So, make sure that you could message me or our group, the Republica Filipina Reenactment Group, for more questions about the revolution, and certainly we will answer them. And I hope you were satisfied and appreciate our discussion for this day. So thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, and good night. Thank you.